Well, I hope you're all doing well, and it seems this morning at least, Hurricane is going to be missing us. Please be praying for those in the Big Bend area of Florida who will be dealing with this. Today we're going to be going through, in this video, Genesis chapter 4 and a bit of chapter 5. Now, we've already mentioned that there are numerous sevens all throughout the text, and that starts from Genesis chapter 1 and continues into 2 and 3 and then throughout the Hebrew scriptures, talking about the intricate, detailed purpose. As I mentioned, it's almost as if the Hebrew Bible is composed of little photos that keep expanding to bigger photos and bigger photos and bigger photos. I'm going to drop in here a little video right now about the Sabbath and how that is arranged in the beginning pages of the Hebrew Scriptures and there throughout. And what you're going to see in this video, I think, is kind of how I see you developing one of your, or hopefully your Tanakh theme paper, whichever theme you choose. You can see kind of how it's all tied together throughout the Scriptures.
The number 7 is a big deal in the Bible.
Yeah, in biblical Hebrew, the word 7 is connected to the idea of fullness or completeness.
And that's something we all long for, but don't often experience. Instead, we find ourselves working endlessly, fighting back chaos with no real rest.
Yes. Now keep all that in mind as we turn to Genesis 1 in the Bible. It begins with darkness and disorder, but then God speaks to bring about light and order so that life can flourish.
And this happens over the course of 6 days.
Each day is marked with the phrase, "There was evening and there was morning." But on the 7th day, something special happens.
God stops and rests.
Right. Creation is brought to its completion on the 7th day. And that phrase, "there was evening and there was morning," it doesn't appear on day 7.
It's like a day with no end.
On the 7th day, God's presence fills his creation. The land provides for all of God's creatures, including humans, who are appointed to rule the world with God forever.
Kings and queens of the 7th day rest. I can get into that.
But the humans are deceived by a dark power, and they forfeit that rest. They're exiled into the wilderness, where they have to work as slaves to the land.
Until they die and return to the dust from which they came.
But God wants to restore humanity back to that 7th day rest. So he chooses to give the family of Israel that experience of ultimate rest so they can share it with others.
But how? They're in Egypt, slaves to an oppressive empire who's grinding them into the dust.
So God confronts Egypt and he liberates the Israelites, taking them through the darkness and chaos on the way to the promised land.
Now, while they're on their way, they find themselves in the wilderness. It's easy to get lost, life is a struggle. They're not in the land of rest yet.
But while they're on the way, God invites them in the wilderness to start living as if they're in the promised land.
But how do you practice the future rest in the wilderness?
Well, God tells them that every 7th day they are to stop their work, or in Hebrew, to Shabbat, so that they can rest and enjoy God's good world.
So take a whole day to live as if the ultimate rest has already come.
Yeah, this is the Sabbath, celebrated every week on the 7th day. But there's more. The Sabbath is just one of 7 festivals that Israel practiced every year, each one anticipating that 7th day rest.
That is a lot of 7s.
And there's even more. Every 7 years, the Israelites were to liberate slaves, forgive debts, and let the land rest for a whole year. And then, every 7 times 7 years was the ultimate 7th day rest, called the Year of Jubilee. If anyone had lost their land or gone into debt, all was forgiven, everything restored.
Wow, so the Sabbath, these feasts, the Year of Jubilee, it's all pointing towards the hope of future rest.
Right. Now, when the Israelites went into the land, they forgot their God, and so they forfeited their chance for rest in the promised land.
They're exiled and enslaved again by an oppressive nation, led back into a world of chaos and disorder.
But Israel's prophets said that their exile would end one day, and that the ultimate jubilee of freedom and rest would come, but generations go by, and they're still waiting.
Isn't it amazing how there are so many ties in, and how the literary patterns develop throughout the Hebrew Scriptures? Gordon Wenham talks about in his book, Genesis 1 through 15, that Genesis 4 is filled with sevens. He writes, throughout the Pentateuch is another name for the Torah, the first 5 books. The sevenfold use of divine speech formula is commonplace, and within this chapter, the number 7 is clearly significant. That is chapter 4. Unusually full details about Lamech, the 7th generation from Adam, may illustrate another convention associated with biblical genealogies, a tendency to draw attention to the 7th generation. Indeed, various key words in the narrative appear a multiple of 7 times. Within 4 verse 1 through 17, Abel and brother occur 7 times, and Cain 14 times within the whole of chapter 2 verse 4 through 4 verse 26. Eretz, that's earth, not land of, is mentioned 7 times. Adamah, land, 14 times. And notice Adam and Adamah are very closely related. Adam is the man from the earth. And then God, the Lord, or the Lord God, some 34 times, exactly matching the 35 occurrences of God in chapters 1, verse 1, 2, verse 3. Lord God being both words at once, so that makes it 35. The last verse of chapter 4, at the time people began to call on the name of the Lord, this contains the 17th mention of the deity in Genesis, and the 14th use of the key word call. In all these respects, chapter 4 is entirely typical of the editorial techniques used throughout Genesis, and its present form must owe much to the final editor. So these patterns you saw, the 7s again and again and again, we see again here in Genesis chapter 4. So we're going to start reading Genesis chapter 4. And we start in verse 1. Now the man knew, that is Adam, knew his wife, Eve, her name means life, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a male child with the help of the Lord. What's fascinating is if you look at the actual Hebrew text, and here I have a portion of, you can find the interlinear of any verse in the Hebrew Bible online, and here it is. Hebrew goes from right to left, not left to right, like English. And so it says, and Adam, okay, knew, yada. Knew is a common way, a euphemism in the text of the Hebrew Bible, to know intimately in a sexual form, but also just intimate knowledge of someone from experience. So many times later on in the text of the Hebrew scriptures, it will talk about how it's important to know the Lord, not to know about the Lord or to know information, but to know, intimately know, and commune with the Lord. And so you could even use yada as a theme that you could run through the scriptures and find how many times that comes up in a book like Hosea, for example, and Jeremiah, etc. But it says, and Adam knew Ath, Hava, Eva, Eve. He knew Ath, Eve. Ath is just to signal kind of direct object. His wife, Ishat, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I have acquired a man. Now, Ath, right here, for the first time in this text, is being translated instead of just the direct object or a connection. And it seems some people have said that Eve thought Cain was the Lord, Yahweh, that he was already the fulfillment of that promise in Genesis 3, that a seed from the woman would come to earth and crush the head of the serpent. Sadly, Cain turns out to be anything but such a one. So most English translations, including the Jewish Study Bible, will translate, I have gained a male child with the help of They insert that interpretation of the Lord. Genesis 4, verse 2 and following. She then bore his brother Abel. So Abel is the secondborn. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of soil. Notice how sparse the narrative of the text is. I mean, this would take years, I mean, at least 9-10 months between Cain and Abel. And so much of a condensation is happening for this story to get to the main points of this story. How is now living east of Eden? How is living outside of the garden? How is it that Adam and Eve now, in their relationship, mistrusting each other, having covered themselves up, being less vulnerable with each other, and now their sons, how is sin and this breach, this brokenness between humanity and God going to be impacted? So she bore then her brother Abel, and Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil, and Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstborns of his flock. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. A common Hebraic way of saying you lose your, you despair. We use the word despair. We might be depressed, but you can also see on the face of an individual often that look that communicates so much. And here that was true with Cain. And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you distressed, and why is your face fallen? Surely, if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, sin crouches at the door." It's fascinating here how sin is now personified as an animal ready to attack, very close at hand to Cain. Sin is now this power that can overcome, and its urge is toward you. It wants to take over. It almost appears right now that sin is being seen like that slithering snake of Genesis chapter 3, ready like a rattlesnake, curled up in a pose, ready to attack. And yet, God says to Cain, you can master it. You can be its master. And that was what Cain needed to be. Someone needed to come. And here we see that Cain is not going to be the master over the snake. Cain is going to succumb to the snakes. Cain, in fact, is going to become an agent of the snake. And that's kind of what the story of the Bible will say again and again, is that different individuals will become agents of this malevolent presence of wickedness that wants to destroy, to kill, to cause chaos, to wreak against creation. Okay? So Cain said to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. The Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He actually is. At least he's his brother's brother. And then he said, "What have you done?" God says, "Hark, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Therefore you shall be more cursed than the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Again and again in the Hebrew scriptures, the blood will cry out, the blood of the oppressed, of the innocents. God's concern again and again, already from the beginning pages of scriptures, God's focus is on humanity and their brokenness and their needs. God is concerned about Cain, about Abel, and the injustice that was done. If you till the soil, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall become a ceaseless wanderer on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear, since you have banished me from this day from the soil, and I must avoid your presence and become a restless wanderer on earth. Anyone who meets me may kill me." And you're kind of going like, who else is there, right? Yeah, we'll get to that. The Lord said to him, I promise, if anyone kills Cain, sevenfold vengeance shall be taken on him. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who met him should kill him. Cain left the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, again, Yada, knew intimately, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he then founded a city and named the city after his son, Enoch. So Cain does two things east of Eden. He finds a wife, has a child, and then founds a city. And the first city of the Bible then is not sets up a pattern, and you could run the city as a pattern throughout the Hebrew scriptures to see how often it is walled cities were places of protection in one sense, but often of violence and injustice, a concentration of everything that is anti God's kingdom and God's will. So, the Jewish Study Bible, in its notes, many of them are so good, and here it says this: the Torah does not say why the Lord accepted Abel's offering but not Cain's. Perhaps we are to infer, but that's what you have to do, that Abel offered his with greater devotion, the choicest of the firstlings as opposed to the fruit of the soil. Alternately, the episode may be evidence of the high regard for shepherds. I don't really think that that's the issue. The story of Cain and Abel thus demonstrates a theme widespread in the Tanakh: the difference between God's will and human conventions, such as primogeniture. What you find again and again is the second-born, the last-born, the least likely, is the one God chooses. And here, it could have been simply to prove to Cain that, Cain, it's not about your entitled status as firstborn that you can come before me. It's always by grace that I accept anyone into my presence. See, I accept Abel, and I can accept you. You can be received, but not on your own status, not on your merit. And I think that's probably more in that text. So the blood does cry out. And I mentioned humanity being made from clay, from the soil, and from dirt, and from water, and now returning to that dust in the form of that blood. And the ground is cursed even more as a result, and Cain is cursed from the ground as a result. It becomes an important pattern throughout the Hebrew Bible relating to the city of bloodshed that you will find again and again. Even Jerusalem is called this by the prophets. When human societies build themselves upon the blood of the innocent, God hears their cry and responds. You'll hear that about the Canaanites, the Amalekites, and how they've lived. You will hear that about, well, you can look at Egypt. You can see that at Sodom and Gomorrah and their atrocities, much more than simply a sexual issue, but other things going on. The atrocities were great, using people, abusing people for my sake. Now, outside of Eden, Cain does two things. I mentioned them a little before. Kind of surprise you because he impregnates his wife. Where did she come from? And he builds a city, but for whom? So Genesis 4:17 says, and he built a city and called the name of the city according to the name of his son. And the name Enoch means inauguration. There are multiple clues that the city is negative, at least highly ambiguous in its development from here on out. In fact, a lot of human culture becomes negative or tainted, at least, even though culture is what God wanted. He wanted Adam and Eve to cultivate the garden and to create. And it was, in that sense, a beauty and a wonder that he wanted. Now, human being, because of the human heart and our being in cahoots with the powers of chaos and the serpent, often now our creations are also very destructive and or dehumanizing. So in a literary sense, the design of Genesis 1 through 11, Cain's city will correspond to the building later of Babylon. which also represents a very negative development. The next thing to note in the text comes in the 7th generation after Adam, when Lamech comes on the scene. And what we see is a accentuation, a over-the-top kind of, this is from Genesis 4:23 to 24. And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, O wives of Lamech. So here's something already. Lamech has 2 wives. He's the first person in the Bible for polygamy, which is treating women as property. And in that sense, that's a negative connotation. You will not find anywhere in the scriptures where polygamy, or polyandry for that matter, is actually sanctioned. From Genesis chapter 2, a man shall leave his mother and father and cling to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. The whole idea there is for a person-to-person, I-thou relationship from the beginning, that kind of encounter. And then he says, give ear to my speech. I have slain a man for wounding me, and a lad for bruising me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. He is bragging now about his murder sprees and the fact that he kills more and does more than Cain. This is the human condition that we see again and again. So the violence spreads. The poem of Lamech, the Jewish Study Bible says, continues the dark theme of violence associated with his ancestor Cain, and attests to the increasing evil of the human race. And each story we get going further, it's like a rock thrown into the pond that causes the waves. So from the garden to the fields, and then it will be to the entire known earth. When we get to our next video and we deal with the sons of God, connecting with the daughters of men and what that means, and how the violence is over the earth and God has regrets over creating humanity, finds Noah, cleanses the earth through the deluge of the flood, which is very similar to the decreation, going back to the first verses of Genesis, of the tohu vavohu, that wild and waste, that formless and void, the darkness over the face of the deeps. And then Noah becoming, in a sense, a new Adam in a new garden as he plants a vineyard. We'll get to that. The hope that comes out at the end of all of this is then the birth of the third-born son, Seth. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, meaning God has provided me with another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain had killed him. And to Seth, in turn, a son was born, and he named him Enosh. And it was then that men began to invoke the Lord by name. In contrast to Cain's birth, which Eve attributed to her own creative powers, I have done this. And in contrast to Cain, who uses his son's name to memorialize his own city, this chapter ends with a chastened Eve who now highlights God's generosity in giving her another son to replace the murdered Abel and, less directly, the exiled Cain. This portrait of Seth as a substitute of Abel is crucial. It begins a design motif that echoes throughout Genesis to 2 Kings. Seth is in the place of Abel, as it says, such as the ram offering later on in Genesis 22 is in place of Isaac. And Judah offers himself at the end of Genesis in place of Benjamin to try to spare his life when they are in Egypt. In contrast to Cain's Enoch, Seth now has a son Enosh, which means human. It's as if humanity gets a fresh start with Seth, which helps us understand the bright note on which this dark chapter concludes, that there is worship of Yahweh. That's it for what we're going to cover in this video. The next one we are going to look at is a video on Noah, the ark, the flood.